Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Sommerville. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, and the title of my talk today is Developing a Moral Sense, Probing the Extents and Limits of Infant Socio-Moral Cognition and Behavior. Okay, so inquiry into the developmental origins of moral reasoning is a long-standing topic of interest, not just for developmental psychologists, but for scholars more broadly. And although we know that research, early research on the development of morality or moral reasoning suggested that moral reasoning was the unique province of adults and adolescents, we now know that the roots of moral reasoning can be traced back considerably earlier in development. So, for example, research by social domain theorists in the late 1970s and early 1980s showed us that even preschool children can make moral judgments, that they can distinguish moral transgressions from violations of social conventions, different than personal preferences. And in more recent work, we've learned that the development of moral sensitivities may emerge in infancy. So, for example, Kylie Hamlin and her colleagues have shown that even within the first few months of life, infants show social preferences for helpful or pro-social agents over harmful or antisocial agents. So today in my talk, I'm going to be focusing on the emergence of socio-moral sensitivities, and I'll specifically be focusing on how and when it is that infants become concerned with issues of fairness. So of course, fairness is central to our moral concerns. We think about fairness and are concerned about fairness in workplace settings, in the context of our romantic relationships and interpersonal relationships at a societal level. No surprise that many different folks are interested in fairness, not just psychologists, but biologists and philosophers and anthropologists and so on and so forth. And of course, there's many different types of fairness, but today I'm going to be talking about the developments of concerns related to distributive fairness. So concerns about how resources are or should be distributed to other people. Now, we know from a lot of work that in particular situations, in situations where adults lack a lot of information about people doing the distributing, the person doing the distributing, or the recipients, they tend to apply what we might call an equality norm or equality principle to resource distribution. So that all things considered, they expect that goods or resources will be distributed equally. That's what they consider to be fair. And in fact, adults' awareness and adherence to this norm has been studied in the context of experimental economic games. And these games have revealed a number of different things. So we know that adults have expectations about resource distributions. They expect equal resource distributions. We know that they evaluate others on the basis of whether they adhere to equality norms or not in these contexts. We know that they act to enforce distributive fairness norms. So they, for example, punish people who don't adhere to distributive fairness norms. And recent research suggests that all of these things are also true of children, that by mid-childhood, perhaps even early childhood, kids will divide resources equally between themselves and others in these types of games. They have expectations that others will do that. And they appear to enforce these norms. They protest, for example, when people violate distributive fairness norms. So in our work, we've been asking about the earliest emergence of a sensitivity to distributive fairness norms, not so much in infants' own behavior, but more with respect to how they respond to third-party situations. The reason we're interested in third-party situations is they get around us having to have, or having infants participate in kind of complex motor tasks. They remove issues related to inhibiting one's own self-interest to really just get at the degree to which infants are aware of these norms, the degree to which they're concerned about them. So today what I want to do is I want to walk you through a series of studies that looks at infants' awareness and sensitivity to distributive fairness norms. You'll hear about 3 different groups of studies today. And so what we try to do in these studies is we try to map our measures onto different processes that we think might be involved in or indicative of more mature moral responses. So we look at expectations. I'll tell you about studies using violation of expectancy paradigm that look at infants' expectations about resource distributions and whether they expect resource distributions to be equal. I'll tell you about infants' evaluations, studies that have looked at whether infants evaluate other people based on whether or not they adhere to distributive fairness norms. And I'll tell you about some studies that look at whether infants engage in enforcement of distributive fairness norms, that infants' reward and punishment behavior. Now, across all of these studies, there's two kind of questions that we're interested in. The first has to do with the developmental trajectory that we see in infants' behavior. So one could imagine that these types of norms are something that either infants come to the world with or are acquired through experience. And by looking at the developmental trajectory, we can get at that question to see whether we see consistency across time in how infants respond to these situations, or if we see change with age and with experience. And to the extent that it's the latter, we're interested in identifying different factors and experiences that might be associated with the acquisition of these norms. So let's start here with infants' expectations. When the infants see third-party resource distributions, do they think that they're going to end with equal resource distributions? So in an initial series of studies that we conducted, we asked this question with 12 and 15-month-old infants. So using a violation of expectancy paradigm, baby saw resource distributions, and those resource distributions ended with either equal or unequal outcomes. So of course, the thought here is that if infants expect the resource distributions to end with equal outcomes, they should look longer at the unequal outcomes. And that's in fact exactly what we found in these studies, that infants as young as 12 months of age look longer at the unequal than the equal outcomes. And importantly, in these studies, when we conducted control conditions where these same resource distributions were aimed at inanimate objects like pillows or plants, infants would look equally at those outcomes. So these findings suggest to us that infants by 12 months of age have some awareness of distributive fairness norms, at least in terms of when it comes to equality. They expect resources to be distributed equally. The next question that we had to ask had to do with how does this look over the course of the first year of life? Do we see evidence of developmental continuity or change? Is this something that infants acquire or something that they come to the world with? So in these studies, we tested infants across the first year of life at different ages, and we tested them on violation of expectation paradigms and gauged their attention to equal and unequal outcomes. And plotting things a little bit differently here is the proportion attention to unequal outcomes that you're seeing here. So above 50% means they're looking longer at the unfair or unequal outcome. And what we found in these studies is that 12 to 15-month-olds act as though we would expect them to. They look longer at the unfair and unequal event. 6-month-old infants, in contrast, look at equally at both events, suggesting that they don't seem to yet have awareness of this norm. And 9-month-olds are somewhere in the middle, so they show marginally longer looking to unfair or unequal outcomes. So these findings suggest that infants appear to be developing the expectations between 6 and 15 months of age, that there's a developmental acquisition here that's going on. What we next wanted to know was whether there might be certain experiences that infants are acquiring that are associated with or perhaps even drive infants' sensitivity to equality and resource distributions. And the particular experience that we were interested in these studies was infant sharing experience. So there's a lot of work that's shown that in terms of naturalistic sharing, what kids are doing at home, is that the emergence of naturalistic sharing tends to be between about 8 and 12 months of age. That's when parents are first reporting that kids are giving them objects. In our work, we took a group of 9-month-olds who were transitional in their sharing behavior. So some of them had started sharing yet, some of them had not started sharing yet, tested them on a violation of expectancy paradigm where we show them the distributions and the fair and unfair outcomes. And then we look at their looking times to those outcomes, and we see whether or not it maps onto what parents have to say about their sharing experience. So in our sample, we had some kids who are not sharing at all, some kids who share only with their primary caregiver, and others who are sharing much more broadly. And what we found in this work is there seems to be a fairly stair-step association between these two things. So parents who say my baby is sharing really broadly at 9 months of age are looking longer at unfair than fair outcomes. That's not true of babies who aren't sharing yet, and babies who are sharing in a more restricted fashion are somewhere in the middle. So what these findings suggest is that the onset of sharing experience seems to be associated in some way, shape, or form with the acquisition of distributive fairness norms. And of course, the big ticket question here is whether it's causally influential. That's a question that we don't know the answer to yet, but are very interested in trying to answer by, for example, training infants at sharing and seeing if it generalizes to their expectations of resource distributions. So I've just provided you with evidence that by at least the end of the first year of life, that babies have expectations about how resource distributions will proceed, and specifically that they think that they will end in equal outcomes. The next thing we wanted to know was whether infants also possess the ability to evaluate others based on how they distribute resources. So again, adults, as I said earlier in my talk, when someone is acting fairly, they think that that's a positive or good thing to do. They might positively evaluate that person, choose to affiliate with that person, whereas someone who does things unfairly, who distributes resources unfairly, might be negatively evaluated, or they might choose not to interact with that person. We wanted to know whether this was true of infants as well. The first way that we looked at this was by testing 13 and 15-month-old infants in a paradigm where they saw resource distributions that were performed by two different actors. And one actor always did things fairly. They always distributed the resources equally. The other actor was unfair. She always gave more to one person than the other. And on the critical part of the experiment, babies saw both of their faces devoid of any resource distributions, and then they heard accompanying vocal stimuli that was either positive or negative. So, good girl, good job, or bad girl, bad job. Now, of course, the question here is what babies do upon hearing this vocal stimuli. Where do they look? And in particular, the idea here is that if they positively evaluate the fair person, they'll look to her when they hear good girl. And when if they negatively evaluate the unfair person, they'll look at the unfair person when they hear the admonishment. And in fact, in the study, that's exactly what we found. What I'm plotting here is the proportion of time infants look at the unfair distributor. You can see that they look longer at her when they hear admonishment than when they hear praise, suggesting that they link up praise with fair behavior and admonishment with unfair behavior. And this is true by 13 months of age. So those findings give us an inkling that infants are not only expecting equal resource distributions, but they also are evaluating people on whether they adhere to this particular distributive fairness norm. Another way that we've looked at evaluations is through infant social preferences. So in these studies, what babies see is they see, again, one person who is the fair distributor and gives things out fairly. And in another case, an unfair distributor distributes resources unfairly. And then babies have the choice of who they want to interact with and who they want to play with, while those two people are doing exactly the same thing. So it's only their prior behavior that baby has to make this judgment about who they want to interact with. And we've done this in manual choice tasks. We've also done this in tasks that require infants to walk towards the person that they choose to interact with. And what we find in these studies is that babies show a systematic social preference for the person who previously acted fairly, in contrast to the person who previously acted unfairly. So we see that by 13 months of age, infants seem to choose social partners based on how they distributed resources. So together, these findings suggest that infants are not only evaluating individuals based on whether they do things fairly or unfairly, but they're using that to influence or form their social preferences, their social affiliations. The last question that we're interested in is whether infants actually engage in enforcement, right? So as adults, we not only have expectations, we not only evaluate people, but we also act to enforce moral norms that we think are important. So we might, for example, punish someone who distributes resources unfairly and reward someone who is a fair distributor. And indeed, we see evidence of these tendencies in adults' performance on economic games. So I'm going to tell you about a recent study that we conducted with 16-month-old infants. So in this study, we were really interested in infants' use of reward and punishment in response to fair and unfair behavior. But we wanted to come up with a method that we thought wouldn't strictly rely on any sort of imitative capabilities or imitative tendencies that babies had from experience they had in the real world. We wanted to come up with something that was novel, that infants had never done before, so that we could get at kind of the conceptual underpinnings of reward and punishment. So in this study, we introduced babies to a touch screen. The touch screen had two bars on either side. And what they learned in a training procedure is that pushing one bar elicited reward and pushing one bar elicited punishment. So this graphic shows you the version of the task that used verbal reward and punishment. So bad job, bad girl, the punishment. Good job, good girl was the praise. In a second experiment, we ran an identical experiment. Instead of using vocal reward and punishment, we showed babies a neutral actor in the middle. And what they learned on training is that if they pushed one side, the person would have a cookie given to them. If they pushed the other side, they'd have a cookie taken away from them. So we looked at reward and punishment in both ways. And as you'll see, the results were quite similar across both types of reward and punishment. Okay, so babies are trained to use this touch screen with no stimuli there. They then moved away from the touch screen and they see distributions. Again, as you can guess, one person does fair distributions. They distribute resources equally. The other person does unfair distributions. And then on test, what happens is that babies see the actors' faces, only their faces, on the screen, and the two accompanying bars from training come up. Babies are wheeled up to the screen, and we just look to see what they do spontaneously. So of course, the hypothesis here is that if babies are systematically rewarding and punishing, they're gonna press on the reward side when they see the fair person. They're gonna more frequently press on the punishment side when they see the unfair person. We also conducted a controlled experiment where instead of seeing fair and unfair resource distributions and fair and unfair people, babies were tested with their favorite and most disliked cookies, or not cookies, foods. So we could get a sense of whether this was just about positive and negative valence or whether it was really about kind of socio-moral norms like fairness. Okay, so this shows you the results from the first two experiments. The vocal reward and punishment is on the left, the giving and taking a cookie is in the middle. As you can see, they both show the same pattern. So what we found in this study is that when babies see the fair distributor, they selectively reward her by either vocal reward or by giving her a cookie. But when they see the unfair distributor, they're at chance. They don't differentiate. They don't preferentially push on one button or the other. So what these findings suggest is that babies are rewarding fair distributors, but they're not punishing unfair distributors. Our control experiment, when babies were presented with their most preferred and least preferred food, showed that babies were at chance in both cases there. So this isn't just something about things that are positively or negatively valenced. It seems to be something more specific to the domain of fairness. So these results suggest that at 16 months of age at least, infants are doing something interesting. They're rewarding fair individuals, but they're not doing the full-fledged kind of more mature response that presumably would also include punishing unfair individuals. And I'll get back to that in a moment and our kind of thoughts about that. So just to summarize what we found and what I think it means. So we see that infants possess some aspects of how more mature moral reasoners would respond to distributive fairness norms and violations of those norms. Namely, they have expectations about resource distributions that are in line with equality norms. They evaluate others based on their distributive behavior. We see those things present by the end of the first year of life, but not necessarily within the first year of life, earlier in development. So these appear to be emerging or acquired sensitivities that are linked to infants' interactive sharing experiences. Again, we don't know whether or not that's causal, but that's an interesting question for future studies. In contrast, the question of enforcement or the element of enforcement doesn't yet seem to be there, at least at 16 months of age. So even though infants have expectations and they're evaluating, they're not going the extra step to systematically engage in reward and punishment in the same way that adults might be. So there's also some important differences in terms of infants' moral responses, at least within this domain. And critically, in other evidence, we see, in other papers, we see evidence that norm enforcement in response to other types of violations may not emerge until at least age 3 or perhaps even later. So there seems to be consistency in terms of what people are finding, suggesting it may not just be restricted to the fairness domain. Okay, so here are some of the outstanding questions that I think that are important and that we're trying to answer. So what are the sources of limitations on infants' early norm enforcement? What's going on here? Why aren't they acting to systematically punish unfair individuals? We've thought of a number of different possibilities, and I'd love to, of course, hear your thoughts as well. The first possibility is that punishment is paradoxical, right? So if we think about the fact that our social evaluations are important insofar as they allow us to avoid people who are potentially antisocial or unfair in this particular case, in order to punish someone who is unfair or otherwise antisocial, you actually have to approach them. So there's something kind of difficult and paradoxical about punishment because it requires overcoming avoidance in order to give someone a punishment in the first place. So that suggests that it may be some kind of limitation on self-regulatory abilities or inhibitory control or something like that, that makes it hard for infants to engage in punishment. Another possibility is that maybe infants don't really understand reward and punishment as a system of causal intervention. So what I mean by this is that we as adults tend to think that we reward good behavior so it will continue and we punish bad behavior so it will stop. And if infants don't understand the functions, the causal functions of each of those actions, then they may not use reward and punishment systematically. Another possibility is that there are limits to infants' perceived moral agency. So if you think about in society who engages in punishment, it's usually someone who is in a position of some kind of authority, right? Parents punish their children for doing something wrong. The legal system punishes criminals, for example. So maybe infants don't have yet a sufficiently developed sense of moral agency or moral authority to engage in punishment. Of course, these aren't mutually exclusive alternatives. They could operate in concert, and there may be many more explanations for what's going on here. And then finally, there's the big ticket question of whether infants are really responding to these transgressions in terms of moral norms per se, right? And this is, of course, a fraught issue in the sense that there's even debate across fields whether norms that are specifically moral actually exist. So it's a very hard question to answer. We're kind of taking two different steps to try to answer this question. The first step is to look to see whether infants show this kind of classic distinguishing feature that a lot of the social domain theorists use to look at preschoolers, responses to moral transgressions versus social conventions. So the idea here is that if you think something is a moral norm, you should think that it's universal, right? It's always wrong to murder someone. But the way, for example, you greet someone in the morning or the type of utensil that you use to eat your food, that's a social convention. So you would expect that to be culturally variable. So we're looking to see, for example, whether babies think that people who they see as out groups, for example, non-native language speakers, will follow fairness norms or not. And if infants kind of broadly apply these expectations across cultures, across social groups, we might say that this is more of a moral norm. If they think it's group specific, specific to their group, we might say it's more of a social convention. And then finally, the other thing that we're doing is we're looking to see whether there is coherence in infants' representations or expectations or evaluations within the moral domain. So as adults, we think that what we learn about someone in one domain of morality, it might be relevant in some way, shape, or form for another domain of morality. If I learned that my next door neighbor hit someone, I might not think that he will be so fair at doing something else. We have expectations that cross different domains within the larger moral domain. And so in this work, we're looking to see, for example, whether babies think that whether or not someone is fair will also be telling for whether they will be helpful or harmful or more generally trustworthy. So I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. I'd like to acknowledge all my terrific staff, students, and postdocs for their critical help from this work. And I look forward to receiving your questions. Thank you.